Hi everyone, and welcome to another After Effects tutorial presented by Matrongs. Today we'll learn how to create an effect that will probably be of great interest for anyone who's in the hair growth industry, because we're going to create a hairy text effect with some cool morphing transitions from one word to another using this kind of effect. Let me show you right now what kind of result we'll get at the end of the session. We are going to simulate the apparition of words that will shape up as if they came from underneath the skin of a very hairy animal. All of that in a very organic manner with great fluidity in revealing each word. It might not be of great interest, but it's a good occasion to discover a special effect we don't use that often in After Effects called CC Hair. This effect was specially made for generating hair on a layer. We're a bit far of real 3D software hair simulation, but still, for a quickly rendered effect, it gives us a very acceptable result in only a couple of clicks. Let's first create a new project in After Effects, then let's create a new composition that we will call hair in a 1280 by 720 resolution on a duration of 10 seconds. That will be sufficient. In this new comp, let's create a new solid by going under Layer, New Solid. We'll also call this hair. The color for the solid is not important for the moment. Before we apply the hair effect, let me just show you what it stands for basically. So let's create a text layer and then let's type in hair. Obviously we can't see it because it's black, so let me open the color panel and make it white for the moment. Scale it up. We can come back to change the font at any time. For the moment, I'll choose the font called BBAS. You can download that font on the dafont.com website. If only I could find it. Bingo, there it is. Let's bring the letters a little bit closer and move it right in the center of the composition. Onto this layer, we'll apply an effect you can get from the effect menu in Simulation CC Hair, which was developed by Psychor Graphics and included in the After Effects package. Once it's applied, the first thing you'll notice is that at its default setting, it doesn't look like much. So we have a couple of different settings, not that many I would say. First we have the length value that will most obviously affect the length of the hair, coupled with the weight value, which will make it so that if the hair is longer it will fall down. By default it's set to 1. If we put 10 it will make it drop very low, so for the moment let's leave it at 1. Also we have the thickness value, which will allow us to increase the width of our hairs, but at the same time it will influence the weight, so make them heavier, resulting in a not very good looking effect. Let's leave it at the default values for the moment. We are just covering here the different settings before we apply the final effect. For the density, let me just lower down this value to 5 here in order to have very short hairs. Density will allow us to increase, well, the number of individual hair forming our hair mass. For example, if I put 10 here, only a few particles will show up. And of course you can increase this value up to the point you think it has sufficient amount of hairiness. The hair fall map will allow us to define a specific layer to use as a map using many different channel settings, for example the luminance and the alpha channel. This will determine how the hair will be influenced, defining how much they grow depending on the area. And that's precisely what we'll be using here in order to animate our text, so let's come back to this part in a few moments. Also we have the hair color setting that will allow us to, let me just increase the density to make our text stand out. Will allow us to manage the amount of coloring we get from the layer's color. Using the color inheritance in relation with the layer's color, for example, if I change the text layer's color to some kind of red, that will make our hairs red, and by lowering down this value here, you can mix that color with another color defined above. Here, let's choose some kind of brownish color. Next, we also have the hair opacity here. Depending on the amount of hair, you can play with the opacity here. Next we have the light settings, where we can set the height of the light source here, affecting our hairs, and also the angle. And finally the shading options. We'll come back to that later when we'll be working on our effect. So let's delete that layer and then create a new composition, which we'll define as our map that will allow us to influence directly the behavior of our hair effect. Let's call this composition hair map. We can even call it just map since we don't have any other one, once again in 1280 by 720. Inside this map composition, let's start off by creating a background. Hit Ctrl Y to create a new solid, and let's call this one background. And what we're gonna do with this background layer is apply a fractal noise effect. So right under effect, noise and grain, fractal noise. That will allow us to generate some random patterns in black and white, and that will be very useful in our case since the hair will react differently depending if it's growing on a white or black area. Leave it like that for the moment. Let's get back in our hair composition. Click here to get to the project panel, and then grab our map composition, drag it beneath our hair solid, and turn off its visibility. Let's turn the visibility on for the solid that we just created, and then from the effect menu, simulation, let's apply CC Hair. By default, hairs will form on the entire surface. Now let's twirl down Hairfall Map, and from the map layer dropdown, let's select our map composition. Right away, we can see that it's influenced by our noise pattern here. What would be nice is to have both views side to side in order to easily compare them. To do that, let's go in the top corner right here and choose Create a New Comp Viewer. With this new comp viewer created, let's click on the handle here and drag it to the right on that purple area. And when we release the mouse button, we will now have two comp viewers. Next, what we want to do is click right here on Hair, then lock it up, and now we'll be able to switch back and forth between our two compositions. So here we have our fractal noise. If we select the layer, we can play around with our settings here in the effect panel, and by increasing the contrast, we'll be able to directly influence the looks of our hair mass. One thing that we should do before we play with our fractal noise is add a little bit more hair. So let's click on the layer with CC Hair applied, and automatically we can get from one composition to another. Let's change our hair settings in order to have a bit of a nicer result. First, what we'll do is lower the length value down to 10, and then let's increase the thickness value up to 1. For the weight, let's raise the value up to 10. Right now I'm giving you the values I used to create this tutorial. Of course, you can always come back and alter the values to what you like best. Let's put 13 here. Next, let's go ahead and increase the density drastically up to 600, just enough to cover the whole area. Already we can start to notice some changes to a somewhat weird effect, similar to the texture of wet sand. Next, let's go ahead and twirl down the light settings here, and then we can play around with this value to alter the height of the light source aimed at our surface generated by the fractal noise. And we want to put something around 80. Then for the light direction, we'll make and sort our light comes from the opposite direction all the way down at 135 degrees. Let's lower down the height value a little bit down to 71. And at last, let's twirl down shading. What we want to do is increase the roughness a little bit up to something like 0.30, and specularity, influencing the highlights on our hair surface. Let's put something like 60. In order to bring back a little bit more of our highlights, next let's lower down the diffusion. This setting controls globally how much light gets diffused around our hairs, so we'll be able to influence the luminosity of our entire scene. So for this value, let's put 30. Right now you could say we're not there yet. Let's go back in the hair color, and what we're gonna do is lower down the color inheritance value to only keep the color tone we previously defined here. Let's punch in the values I used in my demo, so 130, 80, and 10. In order to get some kind of dark orange, let's click OK. And for the opacity, let's lower it down in order to get back more details on our hair surface. So let's go ahead and lower it down to 30% for the moment. We can always come back later and change it when we have our text, which will pretty much change the general look of our scene. Let's twirl down the hairful map. Next, what we want to do is perhaps increase the map strength. Up to something around perhaps 80. And also let's add a little bit of noise, and we'll come back to that later on when we have our text set up. So what we have now is a draft version of our fractal hair surface. Let's go back in the map composition, and let's go ahead and create a text layer on top of our fractal map solid. Let me write down hair, and most importantly, let's make it black. That will make our hairs react to the shape of our text, and automatically we can see the changes we get in the other comp view on the left here. Let's bring this text layer right in the center of our composition. You can enable the title action save guides from the drop down here to make sure we are setting it right. And now let's focus on our background here, which for the moment feels a bit rough. So let's get back in the fractal noise of our layer, and from there we'll change a couple of things. First thing, let's go ahead and change the fractal type from simple to dynamic, which will give us more rounded shapes and also more of an organic feel. Then let's increase the intensity value in order to get the least amount of black possible, something around 50%. Already we can see that we get a little bit less shapes here in the background, but it's still a bit too clean. Now let's lower down the complexity to the minimum value here, 1. So now the shapes forming our fractal pattern has become very basic, small gray stains here and there. Let's smooth down these stains here by going under Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Fast Blur. And let's put a very big value, something like 100. And from this point, as you can see, our slopes are much smoother. Perhaps 100 is a bit strong here. Let's put down 70. Just enough in order to get light slopes around our text shape, simulating some kind of skin texture that's not too straight. We can increase or lower down the luminosity value in order to influence how big are these slopes in the background, so perhaps something like 40 in the luminosity will be sufficient. And let's play around with evolution. That will allow us to put some life into our fractal pattern. So let's alt click on the stopwatch here to enable the expression, and inside the text area let's type down an expression that we use very often, time asterisk multiplied by 30. Let's see how it behaves with those values. For those who are not familiar with this expression, it uses the current timecode value. So for example, right here we're at 0, so it will multiply 0 by 30. At 1 second, it'll be 1 times 30, and so on. And that gives us a linear incrementation on our evolution value, and that will make our pattern change according to the current time value and its multiplicator we defined here. If you want it to evolve faster, let's just put a bigger value here, and on the opposite you can put a smaller value here to have it evolve at a slower pace. So that's about it for our background. Let's now focus on the text, and let's add some irregularities in this hair mass. And let's select our text layer. On that we're going to apply another fractal noise effect, so Effect, Noise and Grain, Fractal Noise, and this time we'll make it sort to keep some black, but we only want a very small amount. We also want to have some different tones of gray. That way the hair doesn't grow with the same amount of regularity everywhere. Setting up the right value will be very simple. So first let's crank up the contrast a bit, up to 186. And also you might want to lower the luminosity and put something around -35, -40. You can monitor in the left com view how the hairiness reacts to the changes we're implementing. Perhaps we'll come back to adjust it later on. Let's do the same with the evolution setting. So let's make this whole thing evolve for the whole duration of the animation. So Alt click here, and let's put time multiplied by 60 to have it move twice as fast. Perhaps we can even put 100 to have it move even faster. It's up to you to decide how you like it best. Right now the background has a subtle evolution while our text is evolving at a faster pace. Now that we're done with our map, let's get back in the hair composition, and what we'll do next is play around with the noise a little bit. That's one of the things we covered earlier. Let's select our hair solid. In the effect panel, let's look at our CC Hair effect. If you remember, in hair fall map we have a noise setting, and if we increase its value up to 10, that will add just a little bit of chaos in the hair mass, and it gives us a hairstyle that's more disorganized. Also, we'll add a wiggle effect on this. So once again, Alt click on the noise value stopwatch, and then type down wiggle, open parentheses, and 0.3, comma 10. So what that will do is create random variations 0.3 times per second. In other words, not very often. On an amplitude, that's our second value in the equation here, of 10%. So from this point, it'll have subtle variations, and this will add a light movement in our hair mass. So if you look closely now, you can notice that by jumping from one point in time to another, each time our hair pattern will be different. Right now our effect still looks a bit sharp, so let's go back into map composition, and we'll go into layer, new adjustment layer. By hitting enter on the keyboard, let's rename this layer blur. And once again in the effect, blur and sharpen, let's add a fast blur effect. And let's increase the value here up to something like 20. If we raise it up too high, we won't be able to read the text, so I think that's a perfect amount, 20. Let's enable the repeat edge pixels feature. What we have created here is a very fun looking effect onto our initial text layer. Next, let's just come back inside our hair composition, and you'll notice something wrong here. Let me just close down the map comp view. We can see that we have a little problem. Our hairs are not growing on the top of our composition. To fix that, we'll use a bigger size for our hair layer. So having our layer selected, let's hit Command Shift Y or just go under Layer Solid Settings. As you can see, After Effects always lets you know what is the keyboard shortcut for your actions. We only need to change the width and height values here in this panel, so let's lock up the aspect ratio to keep our values proportional, and let's increase the width value here up to a point when hair grows all the way up our scene, so in this case something around 1320 by 743. Now we can say we're almost there. Next we need to add up some color correction to this image, so let's go ahead and create a new adjustment layer by going under Layer, New Adjustment Layer. And let's hit enter to rename it Color Correct. And then from under the effect menu, let's go down to Color Correction, Curves. Now let's give it a little bit more contrast by playing with the RGB curves. So let's create a first point here in the light values that will raise it a little bit like so. And a second point right there in the dark values. Let's lower it down a little bit. Now to get back some sharpness, we'll add up two other effects. So let's go under Effect, Stylize, Color Emboss. This will add a bit of thickness onto our hair mass, and let's leave it to its default values. Next, if you want to have it even sharper, let's go under Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Sharpen. And by putting 10 in the intensity value, you'll gain a little bit more in sharpness. Some of you will say that it's too sharp and some other not enough, so it's up to you to make the correct adjustment on the last two effects there. Next, let's add a vignetting effect, so let's create a new solid that we'll call Vignette. Make it to comp size and click OK. Then let's go under Effect, Generate Circle. For the color, let's choose black. Let's generously increase the radius up to 634. Next, let's invert our circle and also increase the feather outer edge setting up to something around 161. So there we have it, a simple vignette technique that we use very often. We can also lower the opacity a little bit. Now it's time to focus on the transition animation in between two sets of characters. So doing that will be very simple. We only need to play around with the opacity value on the text layer. Let's unlock the hair composition by clicking here in order to get back in our map composition. And hitting T on the keyboard will reveal the opacity setting for this layer. Let's reestablish our double comp view system here like we had earlier, hair and map. You'll notice that by lowering the opacity here, we will influence the growth of our hair. If, for example, we put a very small value, they'll be closing in to the interior of the skin, so we'll play around like that to make them grow. With our marker at 0 second in the timeline, let's click on the stopwatch here to create a keyframe on the opacity value. Let's move forward 40 frames, so holding Alt on the keyboard, let's hit page down 1, 2, 3, 4 times. And let's put the opacity at 100%. And once again, let's move forward 40 frames in the timeline. And let's set the opacity back to 0. Let's now drag a box around our 3 keyframes to select them all and click here to go inside the graph editor. Let's make sure all 3 are selected and then click here to ease our keyframes, and then we want to have only the middle keyframe to be selected, and we want to pull on the handles on both sides, just like that, in order to have a small pause at the moment where the opacity value is the greatest. And at all times, there will be this subtle evolution in the hair movement, so everything will always be in motion. So once we have completed this simple animation setup, consisting of making our text appear and then disappear, we'll be able to duplicate our layer. So under Edit, Duplicate, or Command D or Control D on a PC. Hit T to reveal the opacity, then let's offset it in time, so let's drag it towards the middle of these 2 keyframes. So 20 frames after the middle keyframe. And now let's type a different word here in our second text layer. So let's type in morphing. I forgot to center the text, so let's simply do it manually. Let's see if it fits. And we can see now, if we go right at the point when they crossfade, that the mix of both words is reflected in the hair effect that we created, and that makes a really cool transformation effect, even if it might be a little too specific. After that, we can duplicate them at will, so offset them and have as many text transition you want. I'll type down something else here, tuto, and I'll slide it right in the center of the composition. You can also duplicate this layer, scale it up in order to have bigger versions of this text, and everything is updating exactly as it should. It is so simple to put everything in place. You can continue duplicating on and on and on and on. Now we have a very amusing layout here. Obviously the text is all the same, so it might be a little repetitive, but you can see that it's pretty easy to create hairy layouts using your inspiration with black and white. Now let's get back to our hair composition and let's have a look at how it behaves once it's animated. So I'll make a little ramp preview right there. Just before that, let me just save this project. I'll call it Hair Tuto. Et voila. Now let me hit 0 on the keyboard and wait for it to render. So that's about it. We now have our result in front of us, and as you can see, there is always a little bit of evolution going on, just as if there was a slight wind blowing on this hair mass. We don't want them to be too static. After all, what we're doing is called motion design. I hope you enjoyed this little tutorial, or that at least it led you to discover this hairy effect, CC Hair. I encourage everyone to look at all the other effects created by the Psycore team, like CC Particle World and many others, as they can, in certain situations, even if we rarely use them, turn out to be exactly what we need to achieve a unique effect. Now that you understand the principles of hairy text animation, if you find that useful for a specific project, don't hesitate to send me a link so I can see how it turned out in a real situation. Never be afraid to get inside the effects to meddle with the many different settings in order to personalize the effect to your taste. Remember, we can always come back to change, for example, the light settings, and that will totally change the way our hair reacts to the light. We can also modify the opacity, and that will also change the way light reacts. It's really up to you to adjust this technique to your taste. Goodbye everyone, and see you soon in another tutorial.